All right. We decided to hold this for just a couple minutes so that everybody could get switched and settled in between. But I think we're probably about ready to begin. My name is Nicole Savita. I am an affiliated professor of law at the University of Arkansas's LLM program in agricultural and food law. I am also dually appointed and based up in Craftsbury Common, Vermont, where I teach at Sterling College, and I teach in an interdisciplinary sustainable food systems program. And somehow doing both of those things has made me have this illusion that I can move my area of expertise into the realm of ethics and philosophy. And so the project that I'm going to present to you today is the newest project that I've begun working on, and the one I'm most excited about right now, where I'm working with a team of bioethicists and philosophers and other interdisciplinary academics to think about moral mapping of the food system. And my portion of that work has been moral mapping of the labor and community issues in the food system. So I want to kind of give you a sense of the project, and also, we're sitting in a law school, and I'm going to imagine that many of the attendees are here bringing that perspective into the room. And we have very precise sort of mechanistic ways of looking at right and wrong, legal and illegal. And we sometimes resist asking the ethical questions because that's not what we're experts at. And we've set up a law that hopefully nudges us or shoves us towards ethical behavior. But as we know, that doesn't always happen. So I'm trying to kind of pull us up a level to thinking about ethics. So what is ethics? This is this word, ethics and morals. I think the first challenge I had when I started doing this work was even making sure that my understanding as a lawyer of what ethics is was on the same plane as those in other fields. And so ethics is defined as investigation and analysis of moral principles and dilemmas, right? But we also think about ethics as the rules or the guidelines that help establish right and wrong conduct for individuals and for groups. Rules and guidelines starts to sound a lot more like laws and regulations and starts to feel more like where we're comfortable. The branches of ethics, the sort of three big branches of ethics, meta-ethics, where we ask those big picture philosophical questions. What is truth? What is justice? And that's where you can get really heady really, really fast. We're probably not going to do a whole lot of that right now, unless some of you push me in that direction. And then there's normative ethics, which is broken down into many fields. But this is the branch of ethics that helps us define frameworks for how to think about right and wrong. What are we doing to maximize a good? How do we define that good? And then from there, we go to applied ethics. How do we take a normative ethical framework and apply it so that we can use it in a very practical way in our day-to-day lives? And so this exercise of moral mapping of the food system is to go through this inquiry and try to come up with a literal roadmap of how we should be making food choices such that we are, there's probably not a perfectly ethical food choice in any moment, but that we're making more ethical food choices. And if you happen to be interested in learning more about ethics as a field from sort of a basic level, moving up, the University of Texas has a really great resource that I've linked here with these explainer videos on all kinds of ethical concepts. So the questions that we want to ask, if we're going to frame them as ethical questions, the first one is ethical consumption possible in a globalized food system? Are we able to eat ethically with very incomplete information about the provenance of the foods that we put on our plates or that we choose in the store? We also then have to think about, if we're going to make an attempt to do that, what is it that makes a particular food product more or less ethical? And then we need to think about not just the item itself, but our choices. What makes a particular food choice more or less ethical? In ethics, we frame issues as the dilemma, right? What's the problem here? And I think if we're taking a consumer-focused look at this, which the project I'm working on does, we think about the fact that as increasingly conscious and aware consumers, we want to minimize the negative externalities of our food choices. And we're in fact even motivated, when possible, when we're financially empowered to do so, to spend more money to make a more ethical food choice, to have impact with that. So this market-based food movement has evolved, and it asks us to do just that, to vote with our forks and vote with our wallets. Now, many of the other presenters today are actually working on the other side of the food movement, the side that I usually find myself on, which is the advocacy side, where we're saying not everyone can participate in a market-based food movement. Not everyone has equal opportunity to do that. In fact, because so many people, as we heard this morning, are employed by the food system and have very artificially deflated wages, they're not able to do this at all. So recognize that I know that that's a substantial problem. But at the same time, we have this effort. What can we all do? Particularly, what can we do at a time when we don't necessarily feel great about the prospects for a lot of progressive politics? You can buy the right thing. You can support the producers that are doing better. But we often obtain food via very long arm's length transactions. And so we can't really assess and avoid exploitation. We're left with either buying hyper-locally and putting in a lot of time and a lot of effort to know our producers, which is a wonderful thing to do when we're able to do it, or hoping that the information that we see on a package is accurate. And not only hoping that it's accurate, but often looking at the information that is there and reading into it tremendously, right? We see that something has been certified humane, or bears a fair trade stamp, or is USDA organic. And most consumers will look at that and think, oh, organic, that means that not only are certain pesticides not being used here, but they must be treating the workers really well at the same time, right? Because we see that it's a little better, so we assume it's a lot better. And that, frankly, is just how we deal with the tension of not being able to know. Bursting bubbles, and hopefully most folks in this room are already aware of that, that's not really how it works. And so it's really hard to do what you think you're doing when you're spending those extra dollars. I've actually heard people argue that you shouldn't spend the extra dollars at all, and you should take that extra money you were spending and donate it to advocacy organizations trying to work on more systemic fixes to the problem, right? So that's the tension between an advocacy-oriented movement and a market-based movement. But focusing on the market for the moment, the project that I've been working on, which is organized by the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute for Bioethics, is called the Consumer Certifications and Labels Project, Ethically Benchmarking Food Systems. And what we're trying to do is develop ways to mitigate what's called bounded ethicality in food purchasing, allowing us to create change in and through the food system driven by consumers. So bounded ethicality, that's that concept that even the most ethically oriented person can't always act in the most ethical way possible because there are constraints on our behavior. So the first steps in a process like this is to develop ethical standards for food. And the idea here was to do it across all domains of the food system. The standards that we're working on developing are designed to be adaptable for different types of food production and different market networks across the globe. So basically, we don't have like too inflated of an opinion of ourselves or anything, that we can look at the entire food system and we can try to figure this out. And the reason it is such a big project is because of the fact that to do otherwise, to ask right and wrong, and not take into account that tremendous amount of variability, leads you to potential solutions that don't get the whole job done and replicate the same problem of that like individualized certification. So when they first called me to participate in this, I said, "You want to do what?" And then I sort of said, well, I guess I'm game because we got to at least try. So we broke the food system into these 7 domains initially, and they built out this core academic team, taking an expert in each of the following 7 areas, and they asked us to spend about 6 months doing research on our domain and to write out our own moral map. So today, I'm not going to talk to you about any of the ones that are in white. Plant and crops, animal welfare, food safety, water, environmental impact, public health, and nutrition all have separate experts, and we came together earlier this week for the first time in a physical space to present our maps and to whittle down our work and try to figure out what the critical considerations of all of this is, having considered things broadly. But I am going to talk to you a little bit about what goes on in the labor and community sphere. So what is a moral map? I had never heard of one before I'd started this project. And really, it's a list of questions. And in this case, a list of questions regarding the human dimensions of food production, processing, and provisioning. And here I need to kind of make a little bit of a footnote. My research for this particular project has stopped at processing and distribution and does not look at labor issues related to retail workers and restaurant workers. And the reason for that is that if the original idea here was to assess certification and consumer-facing information, the kind of thing you might be able to label, the point of purchase typically stops that. So while we're trying to solve it all, this one came back in. And on all those other domains that I just had up here, by the time it gets to the point of a consumer choice, even if that consumer is, for example, the person doing ordering for the restaurant, many of these other issues are already resolved. So labor is the one that cuts off particularly early. Public health and nutrition also does. So we start asking questions like, who's producing the food that's being brought to market? Who's controlling and who's managing human inputs, the labor inputs, our time, our effort, our energy, the strain and the degradation of our bodies? Who's controlling and managing that work? How is compensation for food system labor allocated among all of the players in the food chain? Who's reaping profit from food chain labor? How is every food dollar we spent being parceled out across all of the hands that touch it? Who shoulders the negative externalities of food production and food chain work? And that doesn't necessarily just mean the laborers who are doing that work and being undercompensated for it, but also the communities that they live in, the children that they have and that they raise who are growing up in really marginalized conditions. The towns in which agricultural production and processing happens as the predominant industry, right? You have whole geographic locations that are transformed because most of the workers in the area are marginalized. How impacts differ among owner-operators, wage-paid workers, their families, and the community. So we have a particular and we can use an example here of antibiotic-resistant infections, right? And so workers are picking up these infections in the chicken houses that they might be gathering and harvesting from. They're bringing them home on their clothes, on their boots, and their families are getting ill. They're experiencing higher incidences of high healthcare need and debilitating health effects as a result. We see that happening. What's then happening in terms of stress and access to healthcare in the community generally? What's happening to intergenerational well-being as a result? So having to look at these things level over level over level. And then thinking about whether food chain workers at base, individually and as a whole in community, actually enjoy some very basic things like liberty, safety, and rights of self-determination. I should pause and say that when I started this work, I was like, well, the fundamental human rights part won't be controversial at all. I can start there. And it turns out, as I've been talking to people, that there is not consensus at all on what fundamental human rights are or how they manifest. You can't just say the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says this, so let's make sure we start at that as base principles. And to me, I think that's been the most disturbing realization in all of this, is that human rights doesn't get us a baseline. And not only abroad, by the way. That doesn't work politically here in the US in the way that I had naively hoped it would. So, practical challenges of a project like this. And this is just sort of a sampling of the ones that came from my map. Questions to ask. How, if we're to develop standards, how do we adjust or supplement those standards or shift where we're emphasizing them at different nodes in the food chain and in different geographical locations? For example, and this is maybe overly elementary, but if we're concerned about protection from the elements for workers at the field level, the concerns there are going to be very different in northern Vermont, where I live, and 18 inches of snow fell last night, than they are going to be in southern Arizona. But there are concerns in both places. So we can't simply say, workers have to have adequate access to shade, for example, because that's not necessarily the primary problem across all these geographic locations. We also have to think about how we avoid decreasing food chain laborer food security while improving conditions, right? So if we do all of this work to improve conditions, and in the process we do get some enhancement of food chain worker wages, but we've raised the price of food to reflect its true costs, have we widened the gap such that that initial raise in wages still leaves you food insecure because the food has become more expensive, right? So how do we control for those sorts of things? How do we develop meaningful metrics to assess the actions of the food industry vis-a-vis the well-being of workers? Well-being is notoriously hard to quantify. It's easier to qualify, but either way, it's hard to know what the drivers of well-being really are, particularly when you're dealing with a population, a diversely constituted population that comes often with a lot of background baggage in terms of health and well-being. You've got people who are traumatized. You've got people who have been historically marginalized. You have people who have children and were not able to get access to prenatal care, so they're already dealing with intergenerational effects. What of this is the continuing fault of the food system and the day-to-day assaults on these people who are doing really hard work, and what is related to a whole set of other drivers? How do we parse that? How do we deal with issues of parity after the bottom rung of the labor ladder gets raised? And really, we're talking, as we heard this morning, with many jobs at the very bottom of that rung. So we lift that up, and then suddenly you have resentment from the middle because we've condensed everything. Now, that's the kind of problem I'd like to have to solve, right? I'd like to be off the floor and solving the next set of problems. But it is important to think about the fact that that's going to be the next phase. How do we improve conditions when many owner-operators struggle alongside their workers, right? Their struggles may be different, but it is very hard to say to a farmer who's barely able to make mortgage payments month over month, who's shipping fluid milk into a commodity system and is taking whatever price they can get, that you're responsible for doing something a whole lot better. And then the big one that kept coming up is, do the ethical problems that I might surface in this mapping exercise shrink relative to the unjust conditions in the alternative situations that the workers may have come from, okay? So it's all well and good to say you don't have access to adequate rest breaks or you're having repetitive stress injuries, but some of the workers will say, yes, but I'm making money, I'm able to send it back to my family. We were living in a place where drug cartels were controlling our city. There are worse ills that I could be facing. So this question of relativism versus absolutism, and making sure that in an effort to increase conditions, we don't drive people back to something that's a whole lot worse and a whole lot less ethical. So, with that, I created this preliminary moral map for labor and communities, and I identified and articulated 150 unique moral issues across the food chain. The map is like 35 single-spaced back and front pages. It's dense, and I could not figure out how to actually present it to you other than to, in a moment, give you a couple of samples of the types of considerations that are in it. But what I did do as I was going through it was group it into these 6 issue areas. So like I said, start with the fundamental human rights, and up there, address the issues around slavery and trafficking, for example, around child labor, around real high-level exploitation, the things that we really ought to be able to rid the food system of, but that we haven't been because of how geographically disparate and isolated a lot of this is. Then think about legal status and protections, which is the topic I'm going to drill down into in a minute, so we'll come back to that. A whole very big long section on working conditions and trying to identify the ethical issues associated with working conditions across the chain. A section on compensation and benefits, which is a really tricky section to work on because when you start using words like adequate compensation across the food system, determining adequacy around the globe is a really challenging thing, and we're really stuck at that point right now of trying to figure out how do we determine that, and how do we measure adequacy and shifts in adequacy over time. And then standard of living and well-being, and in this section we really got to a lot of the community issues as well. And then kind of shoved all together in special issues at the back end are particular issues around fisheries, particular issues related to vertical integration and the moral issues for the farmers that work in vertically integrated systems, and a whole host of other things that didn't quite fit perfectly anywhere else. So some examples of the questions or the statements that get asked. Have recruiters, contractors, employers, and others used violence, threats, false promises, false representations, abusive legal process, debt bondage, or other forms of coercion to forcibly obtain or extend human labor against the will of the worker? So it's a way of saying what are the things that lead to trafficking and slavery? How do we say you should have an ultimate right to liberty in food chain work? Here's a way of articulating the things that drive it and what we're assessing. Do particular production practices create long-term cumulative health risks for workers, their families, or their communities, i.e. from exposure to pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, fertilizers, noise, pathogens, or repetitive motion and stress? Now, you can see here how the work I'm doing on this map might overlap with the work that someone is doing on plants and crops, or on food safety, or on environmental impact. And so at the meeting we just had this week, we took all these maps and we literally storyboarded them around a room and started finding the overlaps and figuring out how we could whittle our big work down into a set of places where we could find those leverage points and try to make an impact across the domains. Another example, in areas of the world where youth provide an important source of labor on family farms, especially in subsistence farming or food systems, are school calendars and daily schedules designed to accommodate this work? So the reason I put this one up and share this as an example is that it's all well and good to say we want a food system that is free of child labor. What's child labor? How do we define child labor, right? And when the FAO defines child labor, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, they define child labor in relative terms based on what the educational system is in the particular part of the world. So the age slides, and in places where there isn't, like for example, access to regular education past the age of 12, the standards change. So even still, taking that into account, how do we make sure that we're not hamstringing smallholder producers who depend on family labor and labor in their cultural systems and make them less able to participate in the food system? Do workers have meaningful opportunity to collectively organize, participate in action, and bargain to improve working conditions? Are they protected from retaliation for exercising or attempting to obtain such rights? Why is this phrased in this way? Why didn't I just say, do workers have the right to unionize? Because unionization isn't the mechanism for this everywhere. So again, by taking an ethical frame instead of a legal frame, we're looking at what are we really asking for. So we're gonna do a sample one, and I'm hoping we have enough time to, yeah, we do. Okay, to do a little bit of an exercise in groups. Is it ethical for a society and its economy to benefit from the labor of undocumented, unauthorized, potentially stateless workers who lack the basic protections of citizenship or legal status? So I've set you all up here. I'm hoping that nobody disagrees with the answer I've selected, but bring it if you do. I'm ready. So we're dealing with a food system, and we're drilling right down here to the US, where much of our food system is premised on the fact that the people who are doing the work lack these very basic legal protections of status. And if we think it's unethical to do that, well, the original answer typically is figure out how to create legal status. There's a present problem. We have a very sharply limited politics of the possible where this is concerned right now. Our immigration policy is pulling in the other direction and pulling in the other direction really fast. So from an ethical standpoint, is it more or less ethical for us to continue pushing for an immigration-based solution in the US? Or do we need to start thinking about ways to create alternative structures to ensure the kind of protection that we hope and expect would arise from legal status? Now, I'm not saying there shouldn't be people working on reasonable, fair immigration policy. What I am saying is, alongside that work, as we try to solve problems in the food system, are there additional solutions we should be looking for to address the manifestations of the marginalization that comes from lack of legal status? And this is where Mark Johnson, the philosopher who defined the concept of moral imagination, would ask us to envision the full range of possibilities in a particular situation to try to solve an ethical challenge, right? And so it asks us to break away from what we're doing right now, which is to say, people need to have a legal status. They need to have a pathway to citizenship. We need, as you said this morning, we need more than just DACA. We need real solutions in the immigration front, and we do. But how else could we try to solve the problem? Okay? So how do we combat marginalization and safeguard rights in the absence of status? And we're kind of sort of close to three groups. What I might ask you guys to do is some of the folks on the center shift off to one side or the other, because I'd like you to think about the particular problems, and I'm hoping by virtue of just where you're seated we'll get some expertise in each area. But have one group work on agrochemical exposure, have another group work on sexual exploitation, and another group work on wage theft, for like the super fastest discussion that you can have on these issues, and really going back and thinking about what do we do to try to create rights, to create realization of some rights around those issues without legal status. And I guess as a very quick primer, just to say that when you don't have legal status, even if the law says something shouldn't be happening to you, the lack of status prevents you from going forward and exercising those rights. So just to be clear, that's the dilemma right there. Okay, can we do this for just a few minutes and have you guys talk to each other instead of just me talking at you?